Hypocrites and gentlemen. What we have here is a lot of hypocrisy concerning Democrat efforts to destroy and dismantle the Electoral College. The only link you'll need is below, and it's much more detailed there. I'm going to cover some of it here, but not all of it. And a lot of the info I have comes from 3 videos. 2 by me and 1 by the great Tom Woods. And I highly recommend listening to Tom Woods' video on the Electoral College. And those are all linked in there as well at the link underneath the video. So here's some pushbacks to the people who are having hissy fits over the Electoral College now. And a lot of them, like David Miss Pakman, that half-retarded tween that got on mommy's laptop and got a YouTube channel. He finally learned about the Electoral College in 2000 when he was in elementary school, I think. Well, maybe he was still in diapers. But here's some pushbacks I've got. 1. What if nobody achieves the 50% plateau? What if there are numerous candidates who are popular in some isolated areas of the country, but not more than perhaps regionally, such as George Wallace in 1968 or Strom Thurmond in 1948. Both made inroads in the South. And what if the popular vote winner only gets 33%? There's another person with 30%, then 20%, 9%, 5%, etc. Are you clowns saying that a person who had 67% of the country vote against them should be president? David Miss Pac-Man does, but then again, he probably ate paint chips as a child. Does this mean we'll have a runoff election, since the POTUS election is a quasi-jungle primary like those in Nebraska, California, and Washington? Well, are we going to have a runoff featuring the top 2 candidates? We'll rerun an entire national election a month later. Are you ladies kidding me? 2. What if we need a recount? I covered state laws regarding thresholds for recounts in another piece. What if we need a recount? What are we going to do then? We're going to recount the whole thing. If we set the threshold at less than 1%, then we would have If we set the threshold at less than 1%, then we would have national recounts in 2000, 1888, 1960, 1880, 1968, and 1884. There were a couple of them that were less than 0.5%. The Gore-Bush fiasco was 0.51%. So we'll recount the entire country? Really? Imagine a few hundred Brenda Snipeses finding, quotation marks, finding thousands upon thousands of ballots all over the country. The circus in Florida would become a nationwide phenomenon, as you would have a lot of Democrat election officials finding votes. Oh, I found votes in the trunk of a car, found them in a warehouse. Oh, I found them on this shelf here. Can you imagine that on a national scale? Number 3. Democrat incentive for voter fraud is easier under a popular vote scheme. For example, State C is projected to be a battleground for the first time in eons. To win the Electoral College and the election, the Democrat machine has to get dead people, people who don't exist, cigarette smokers who sit around on YouTube all day doing nothing, morons, transients who don't know where they are, let alone who to vote for. They have to get that fabled Democrat demographic to the polls in that state on election day, or have someone fabricate some absentee ballots. Under the national popular vote scheme, all they have to do is just keep doing what they're doing in states that require basically no verification to vote. Number 4. Democrats who are elected president without a 50% majority in the popular vote. Grover Cleveland, 1884 and 1892. Woodrow Wilson, 1912 and 1916. In the former election, Woodrow wasn't considered the best candidate by more than 58% of the voting populace. How is that a victory if one agitates over the popular vote? Harry Truman in 1948, John F. Kennedy in 1960, Bill Clinton in 1992 and 1996. In 92, almost 57% of the voting populace did not think Slick Willie was the best person for the job. 51.98% of the voting populace didn't think Hillary Clintonoid was qualified. Excuse me. That was pretty loud. 51.98% of the voting populace didn't think Hillary Clintonoid was qualified for the job. In the 8 elections I mentioned above, the average popular vote percentage was 47.1825. Hillary Clintonoid received 48.04, which wasn't much higher than those Democrats who didn't hit the 50% threshold yet were elected president. For what it's worth, all post-World War II elections, that's 1948 to 2016 for you progressives listening, the person who won the Electoral College and became president received an average 51.6994% of the popular vote. That's quite a bit higher than Clinton's percentage. Interestingly enough, the French-looking candidate, John Kerry, and Uncle Albert Gore Jr. received a higher percentage of the popular vote than Hillary Clintonoid and did not become president. Richard Nixon received a higher percentage of the popular vote than Hillary, yet he was not inaugurated in 1961. Slick Willie Clinton failed to get 44% of the popular vote in 1992, yet he became president. Michael Dukakis got a higher popular vote percentage in 1988 and didn't become president. Number 5. Samuel Tilden was the only presidential candidate who received more than 50% of the popular vote, 1876. David Miss Pakman and Stan Cedar are probably Googling that right now. Real Samuel Tilden, who'd that be? He received more than 50% of the popular vote and did not win the Electoral College. Perhaps if Uncle Albert Gore Jr. or Hillary had hit that threshold, he would have a slightly better case. Not really. Sorry, not sorry. Tom Woods, number 6. Tom Woods mentioned this in his video. California has an incentive to get more illegal aliens to the polls under the National Popular Vote scheme. With the Electoral College, they can pile on a few 100,000 more votes, and much of it is mitigated. Under the National Popular Vote, it is not. Number 7. Tom Woods also mentioned that the founders ensconced the Electoral College in our presidential elections because different states have different demographics, cultural, and political viewpoints. That's true today as well. Ask anyone who lived in the rural Deep South for decades and then spent a few years in New York City. It's like being on another planet. Back then, Georgia had different political priorities and people than New York State, and that's true today. The founders didn't want New York dictating for the entire nation. I urge you to watch all 3 of those videos that I mentioned at the start, and it will refute the ignorance of carnival barkers like David Miss Pac-Man, Old Brown Teeth Rants, and the janitor McCain is through X. They don't care about the little guy unless it's implementing some sort of income redistribution scheme, taking the fruits of my labor and handing it over to folks who probably should have used a condom. Number 8, under the NPV scheme, forgetting all the court challenges that will come against it. I do discuss that in the piece as well. Under the National Popular Vote scheme, there would likely be some sort of equal protection suit brought concerning voter verification. Why are some places like Philadelphia, New York City, California so lax on validating eligible voters, and in other places like Iowa or Indiana, for example, I have to prove who I am prior to voting? I cannot just walk up, announce a name, sign a sheet, and vote for Hillary Clinton. This suit would point out these differences and would likely pave the way for a national Indiana-style voter requirement. I assume California Democrats or Democrats in the Granite State would go bonkers over that. Number 9, the NPV scheme would probably encourage more sham candidates like Greg Orman to siphon off votes in areas where the other guy is popular. In the Electoral College, he can siphon off all the votes he wants, but if he doesn't win the state, it does him no good. Under the MPV, if the popular vote is razor thin, as it has been in some cases, those shenanigans would probably be more effective. Evan McMullen was a good example of this, too. He probably siphoned off 250,000 votes from Donald Trump in Utah and Idaho. However, since he did not win either state and Trump did, it did him no good. And under an NPV with an 1880 popular vote barn burner, he could sway the outcome. So let's continue. Those are my bullet points at the start. Democrats are back to having bipolar fits over the Electoral College. Well, at least since 2000 when they learned about it. And Walter E. Williams has a good pushback to it. I'll just cut to the chase on Walter's point. What if, for example, he said, what if it would require, like say under Obama, instead of 2/3 to override a presidential veto, the Republicans were allowed to override any of Obama's vetoes with a simple majority vote. He mentions the founders had utter contempt for majority rule, which is why they created two chambers, and they both have to pass the exact same bill, and then the president has to sign it. And by the Connecticut Compromise was further proof that they had utter contempt for majority or mob rule. So he just basically goes through all that. I mean, what if it only required 50 plus 1 to override any of Obama's vetoes? Then Congress would basically be running the country. And you can go read the whole thing for yourself. It's a lot more detailed than that, but that's the main thrust. He does quote James Madison, quote, "Democracies have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths," end quote. So I'm thinking David Packrat, or Miss Pac-Man, and that Broman Plansky supporter Stan Cedar probably would have had a hissy fit if 51 senators could have overrode any of Obama's vetoes. The Electoral College is evil, but you still need 2/3 to override Obama's vetoes. Okay. Here's a little note on the National Popular Vote Scheme, another one. So one can imagine the hysterics should enough states vote to engage in NPV right before a presidential election, and then that election sees the popular vote winner. Candidate A gets 47%, candidate B gets 46.7%, candidate C gets 6.1%, and so on. But let's say candidate A, who got 47%, lost the Electoral College. 270 electoral votes to 268. I'm sure the Supreme Court would expedite the proceedings, but it could take months, and the occupant of the White House would be in question for some time. What if the above scenario happens and candidate A and candidate B both have 269 electoral votes or less? What then? Are they going to trump the House of Representatives in their constitutionally obligated process to choose the president? Because even if they ram the NPV through with this compact and didn't amend the Constitution, you still have the constitutional requirement that the House of Representatives choose the president if neither one of them have 270, if nobody has a majority. And when they said a majority, that's 270 electoral votes. It doesn't mean whoever had the most. Here's a quick note. Jill Einstein made a inadvertent good case for voter verification. Green Party candidate Jill Einstein surpassed her original recount fundraising goal easily on the suggestion that a tiny 50,000 vote shift could tip the Electoral College to Hillary Clinton. In addition, if we're going to go bonkers over a 50,000 vote shift, then that means voter fraud doesn't need to be widespread to swing an election. If we're going to go bonkers over a 50,000 vote shift, then we need photo ID requirements for voting, and we need voter roll maintenance because it's estimated that there were 45,000 duplicate votes, that's people voting in two states, in the 2016 election. That alone was almost her 50,000. Jill Einstein just admitted that voter fraud doesn't have to be widespread at all for an election to be stolen or hacked by the Russians, so it's important that we make sure no invalid votes are counted. Even the mentally ill David Miss Pac-Man can understand that. Jill did sucker a lot of retards to waste their money sending it to her so she could basically do nothing. Here's a little note about Connecticut joining the National Popular Vote Scheme. The Constitution state has drifted far from its roots. What would founders such as Roger Sherman think? The Connecticut statesman was an influential delegate at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The Great Compromise, sometimes called the Connecticut Compromise, which gave Congress its bicameral structure, might never have been brokered without him. Moreover, Sherman was one of the many delegates from small states who refused to go along with the idea of a direct popular vote for the presidency. He knew that little Connecticut would be outvoted time and time again. The people at large, Sherman told the convention, will generally vote for some man in their own state, and the largest state will have the best chance for the appointment. The 2016 election showed just how reasonable these fears were. Much has been made of Hillary Clinton's victory in the national popular vote, but less attention has been paid to where she achieved that victory. More than 20% of Clintenoid's 65.8 million votes came from only 2 states, New York and California. Indeed, if we remove those states from the national tally, Clinton loses by more than 3 million votes. Such a lopsided result is not what she had in mind, of course, as she surely wishes that she could move some of those votes to Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. She needed to diversify her support in order to win because of the Electoral College. She failed to do that. Now imagine what Clintonoid or any candidate would do without the restraints inherent in the Electoral College system. If Clinton reaped a reward from those landslide victories in Los Angeles and New York City, wouldn't she have worked even harder to run up her tallies there? Why would she make extra visits to Rust Belt states if she could make up the votes with massive voter drives in the big cities? With the Electoral College, the Democrat Party received a firm reminder not to take those states for granted. Without the Electoral College, such states, which make up vast swaths of the electorate, could simply be ignored. And I got a note here, Democrats care about the little guy when it comes to Supreme Court cases. Democrats were wringing their hands that the little guy may not win Supreme Court cases even if he's twisted the Constitution into oblivion. Democrats don't care about the little guy when it's an aggregate of voters in the Dakotas, Iowa, New Hampshire, or Idaho. The NPV scheme would also encourage California to engage in more illegal alien voting. I'm not sure midgets like David Miss Pac-Man understand that Donald Trump wasn't going to waste political capital campaigning to Medicaid recipients in California. Let's go back briefly to more than 20% of Clinton's 65.8 million votes came from only 2 states, and how the Electoral College system forces a candidate to rely on numerous states, or in the case of Maine and Nebraska, a district or 2, and not just pad their total in a few areas. So I used David Leap's website for my totals, and I went through all the POTUS elections from 1948 through 2016. I picked the top 3 states of each candidate and saw what percentage of all their votes came from those top 3 states. And I even included some third-party candidates. For example, Gary Johnson, since he got over 3% nationally, was in my totals for 2016. And for all World War II presidential elections, the 1948 through 2016 average for each candidate, their top 3 states, gave them 23.51% of their votes. In 2016, and I've got all of them, I'm not going to cover all of them here. Donald Trump, his top 3 states in nominal votes, not where he cleaned Hillary's clock and won 80% of the vote or whatever. His top 3 states, Texas, Florida, California. He got almost 13.8 million votes in those 3 states, and that was 21.88% of his total, which is lower than the 23.51% average. Trump diversified his support better. Gary Johnson's 3 top states were California, Texas, Illinois, giving him over 971,000 votes, which was 21.64% of his total. But Hillary, her top 3 states, California, New York, Florida, gave her over 17.8 million votes, and that was 27.05% of her total versus the average of 23.51% versus Trump's 21.88% versus Gary Johnson's 21.64%. So Hillary Clinton had far too many far too many eggs in too few baskets, running up your total by receiving votes from Medicaid recipients and fatherless children in Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, and California isn't good enough. Progressives today lament this because they care about the little guy, unless the little guy is the Dakotas, Iowa, Maine, New Hampshire, Montana, Idaho, etc. Flyover country. You have to appeal to a wide number of demographics and areas. Hillary did not. Trump could have wasted $50 million campaigning for months and running ads in New York and California, possibly narrowing the gap in California and the Empire State by 1 million votes. And for what? Maybe those efforts would have cost him in toto 500,000 votes in Iowa, Michigan, and Wisconsin. It wouldn't have done squat for him, as he's smart enough to know that padding his totals in Texas, Ohio, or Georgia, or trying to close the gap in California and or New York wouldn't mean a thing. If this were an NPV scheme, the National Popular Vote scheme, then Trump may have spent a lot more money in California and New York, but it isn't. These riddle and addled troglodytes like David Miss Pac-Man the guy with the bloated face, Stan Cedar, the janitor, McCain is through X, and the rest of them squawking about Hillary Clinton's popular vote win rings hollow. Hillary didn't get close to 50% either. Do they think she should be president because 51.98% of America didn't think she was qualified for the job? Trump knew it was not a popular vote election. Ergo, he didn't waste time campaigning to the great unwashed in California. He wasn't going to waste time and money on inner city Chicago and its Medicaid recipients. Hillary knew this too. She wasn't going to waste time campaigning in poverty-stricken Mississippi, and she wasn't going to use a lot of political capital in Texas. Those who continue to agitate over the popular vote are either stupid and or lying. I also bring up again, as Tom Woods did in his videos, California will have a bigger incentive to, in an NPV scheme, to have more illegal aliens voting, which I'm sure there are plenty of them voting already. The Electoral College blunts some of the illegal alien voting being done in California. Some municipalities in Maryland are trying to allow illegal aliens to vote in municipal elections. They will likely be voting in federal elections at some point, but I'm sure that Maryland will say, oh, they won't be doing that. Considering that places like Philly and New York City have basically no mechanism to detect ineligible voters, I am totally sure that these non-citizens who are voting in municipal elections won't be casting ballots in close congressional contests. Wink, wink. Another argument the riddle and addled progressives often engage in is whining that most states don't decide the election. Well, maybe if California wasn't full of functionally retarded mouth breathers and fatherless children, perhaps the Democrats wouldn't dominate there. Maybe the political parties who spend outrageous amounts of money on elections and get out the vote efforts, maybe they need to step up their game. Maybe the American people need to realize there are more than two parties in Washington and quit voting for the lesser of two evils. It reminds me of some of the whining when Iowa's wrestling team, the most dominant team in college sports regardless of era. It reminds me of when Iowa's wrestling team was cleaning house when Dan Gable ruled the roost. Maybe the other teams need to step up their game and get better. Some people are upset that Alabama and Clemson are ruining college football because they're always in the playoff. Maybe the other teams need to get better. Maybe people need to realize there are more than two political parties. That said, battleground states have changed a lot over the years. Often there are several battleground states coming into an election only to find out, such as Iowa in 2016, that a candidate won easily. So perhaps polls, and 2016 wasn't the first time we saw skewed polling, perhaps polls aren't the best measurement. Just because your polls are wrong doesn't mean we need an NPV. There are a lot of candidates, Hillary Clinton comes to mind, that thought a state was going to be a battleground only to find out they got a drubbing at the ballot box. So we will restrict our discussion to states where the margin of victory is 3% or less. Also keep in mind a 3% margin of victory in California is still a hefty margin. So I went through and looked at all the states that were battlegrounds. That's less than 3% margin of victory. So if someone won 51-49, just in case some progressives are listening, that's a battleground. And there haven't been a ton of battlegrounds anyway. Here, as go over it. For the presidential elections, 1948, 52, and 56. 19 states in those three elections were battlegrounds out of 147, which is 12.92%. Out of a possible 147, only 19 states in those three elections had a 3% margin or less winning margin between the winner and the second place person. Only 12.92%, only 19 states. And the presidential elections 1960, 64, and 68. If you know your politics, you know it probably went up because there were some close elections in there. 27 states were battlegrounds out of 153, which is 17.64%. For the POTUS elections 72, 76, and 80, again, 27 states were battlegrounds out of 153, which is only 17.64%. For the POTUS elections 1984, 1988, 1992, 15 states were battlegrounds out of possible 153, which is 9.8%. For the presidential elections 96, 2000, 2004, 22 states were battlegrounds out of 153, which is 14.37%. For the presidential elections 2008, 2012, 2016, 16 states were battlegrounds out of 153, which is 10.45%. So you say, oh, most states don't decide the election today. It's never really been most states. That's just the way it is. Remember my example about the Iowa wrestling team. Maybe the other parties need to get better. Maybe America needs to realize there aren't just two political parties and quit. Who are you voting for, the Republican or the Democrat? Because that's all the media tells us, and I don't think independently either. I did need to mention this concerning the whining about white racism tilting the 2016 election, as a lot of progressives have said that. I've also heard progressives complain about being ruled by a minority. What? According to the 2010 census, 60.7% of America is white alone, not Hispanic or Latino. So, how can the election be tilted by racist whites who are a majority and at the same time have America ruled by a minority? Which is it? Dummies. Oh, maybe just white Republicans are evil. Now some quick notes concerning equal Senate representation, which has stoked the bipolar disorders of many progressives. Going back to how progressives love the little guy when they're questioning John Roberts during Senate hearings, but they hate the little guy when the little guy is sending his electoral votes to people who aren't married to rapists. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Let's look at some census numbers. These are the flyover states. What I did is I found went back to the census, each census, found the 10 smallest states. That's flyover country. The stupid rubes, That's not California, New York, and, Washington, Oregon. It's not the coast where all the people live. These are the flyover states where all the dumb hicks live. And those damn Republicans in them flyover states and the Electoral College are denying Hillary Clinton her birthright as president. And take the 10 smallest states in the 1960 census. After the 1966 midterm elections, those 10 states saw a 11-9 Democrat advantage in the Senate. The 10 smallest states, that's 20 senators, after the 1966 midterm elections, 11 of those senators were Democrats. 9 were Republicans. So I guess Democrats benefited from flyover country too. Took the 10 smallest states from the 1980 census. After the 1978 midterm elections, those 10 states saw another 11-9 Democrat advantage in the Senate. So there's flyover country giving Democrats a majority in the Senate, helping them. Then I took the 2010 census and the 10 smallest states there. Those flyover states had 13 Democrat senators and 7 GOP senators after the dust had settled from the 2008 congressional elections. That was okay when Obamacare and Dodd-Frank were being rammed down our throats, but now those same 10 states today, after the 2018 midterms, are evenly split. So I guess those flyover idiots aren't so stupid after all. In my article, I also stumped for a repeal of the 17th Amendment, which I've mentioned in other articles many times. Without the 17th Amendment, a lot of this outside spending progressives are angry about. Well, they're angry about outside spending when they lose. A lot of this outside spending progressives are angry about would evaporate. These outside spenders would have to appeal to the state legislature. And if any progressives are listening, just go look up the 17th Amendment. I'm sure MoveOn.org will be urging its great unwashed to send form letters to their legislators, and if they're MoveOn.org supporters, I doubt they even know who their state senator and state rep are. Send form letters to their legislators telling them to put Bernie Sanders in there or something. I also cover what-if scenarios. What would the makeup of the Senate be without the 17th Amendment? I will not cover it in this video. Go read it for yourself. Progressives really stirred up a hornet's nest when they rammed Obamacare down our throats, and the split-ticket voting that was prevalent for so many decades, that's one thing that has changed. Split-ticket voting that was prevalent for so many decades basically went out the window around that time. I reckon if the end of split-ticket voting was benefiting Democrats, they wouldn't be so angry. Alas, Split ticket voting is an endangered species, and Democrats are getting the sharp end of the stick. This is another reason why they're attempting to nationalize almost everything. This blunts the beatings they've taken in local elections over the past decade. They've basically lost the entire. If they nationalize everything, it will blunt all the beatings they've taken in state elections since 2010. They've basically lost the entire South, which they used to own, lock, stock, and barrel. Obamacare was a straw that broke the camel's back. After the 2012 state legislative elections, the GOP controlled 27 legislatures, the Democrats only 19. The GOP controlled 30 legislatures as the senators whose terms were up for renewal in November 2016 were on the horizon. As you can see, the Democrats probably would not have fared well, as those states' voters gave Republicans control of a lot of legislatures. The GOP also had control of 30 legislatures in February 2018, and those would have been the folks appointing the senators whose terms began on January 3rd, 2019. Again, it would have been bad news for the Democrats. Here's another reason to get rid of the 17th Amendment. Beta male, Beto O'Rourke, he is a beta, wouldn't be, I keep wanting to call him Beta for some reason. Beta O'Rourke wouldn't be able to run to his wife's daddy to spend a lot of money buying votes because they wouldn't be able to buy the entire Texas legislature. Hillary Clinton probably would not have been able to state shop for a place to get a seat in the Senate so she can keep her ugly face on TV more. The New York legislature would have likely chosen someone who actually grew up in New York, has actual ties there, runs a business there, or like Bernie Sanders doesn't do anything, and possibly spent some time in the New York legislature itself. No state shopping for you, Hillary. Even the Clinton Foundation couldn't buy the entire New York legislature. If another Roy Moore scenario, who hasn't been convicted of anything, by the way, not yet, probably never will, if another Roy Moore scenario came up and the legislature was merely discussing him as a possible candidate, they could quickly withdraw him from consideration and likely, if it's Alabama, pick another Republican. If a person got elected to a Senate seat and then some improprieties came out, they could be removed from office, and then the state in which she resides would appoint a suitable replacement from the legislature. If Roy Moore, who I doubt I would have voted for had I lived in Alabama, if Roy Moore had not won the GOP primary, these fake allegations against him would not have come out. They waited until he won the primary, and then the specter of these allegations hovered over him, as they did with Brett Kavanaugh. They waited until Trump nominated him to the Supreme Court. If he had not been nominated, the fake allegations against him would have remained dormant. That election wasn't about who had the better plan or no plan for Social Security reform, who was the biggest warmonger, who thinks low-income housing tax credits are ineffective, who says the Supreme Court adheres too much to stare decisis or not, who had the best plan or no plan to actually balance a budget. It was all about Roy Moore and whether he had sexual trysts with underage women. Minus the 17th Amendment, that probably wouldn't have happened. And perhaps Luther Strange would be serving in the Senate instead of some brain-dead hillbilly named Doug. Remember the Roland Burris fiasco in Illinois? Without the 17th Amendment, Blagojevich would not have replaced Barry Obozo. It would have been the legislature. After Burris's appointment, he was exposed as a corruptocrat and decided not to seek re-election. All the scandals surrounding Burris himself and the chicanery around his appointment caused enough angst that the land of Lincoln's great unwashed, when I say that I'm basically referring to Chicago. Some of my friends in Illinois say they are from Southern Illinois, aka the good part. All the scandals surrounding Burris caused voters in Illinois to send a Republican to Washington for the next 6 years. If there's no 17th Amendment, the state legislature would have made the appointment, and at that time it would have likely been a Barry Obozo clone, not Mark Kirk. Kirk was sent packing at the end of his term, plus a few months, so the legislature would have resisted the heat of the moment urge to throw out corrupt Democrats in favor of Republicans. I would urge you to get a hold of your elected officials, local or otherwise, And let's begin the process of repealing the 17th Amendment. It should, like prohibition, be relegated to the dustbin of history. In conclusion, Democrats are having autistic fits over the Electoral College and equal Senate representation because it's not democratic. Well, it wasn't designed to be. Maybe the founders had the vision to see into the future and see that California would be full of do-nothings that do nothing. Get it? But produce children who can barely read and sweep the floor but deserve free stuff because they convert oxygen to carbon dioxide. Maybe they had the foresight to realize some states would eventually be full of low IQ morons and didn't really want that majority running the country into the ground. Repeal the 17th Amendment. And again, there's a lot more at the link underneath the video. That concludes my spiel on the Electoral College and progressive attacks on it. There's a lot more at the link, and it's a lot more informative than listening to Stan Cedar read off a teleprompter or see David Miss Pakman autistically repeat what Rachel Mandow already said last night. Have a nice day.